There is a particular kind of silence that follows a man home from a 12-hour shift in cardiology. It is not a peaceful silence. It's the silence of a mind that has spent the entire day making decisions that determined whether people lived or died, of hands that sutured arteries, of eyes that read monitors, of a voice that had to remain steady even when the news was not. By the time I turned my key in the front door at 11:30 that Tuesday night, I was not James Park, husband. I was James Park, head of cardiology at St. Aldrich's Medical Center, and I was bone-tired in the way that only surgeons and soldiers understand. The lights were on in the house. I could see the warm glow through the frosted panel beside the front door, and I could hear the soft murmur of women's voices and the gentle clink of wine glasses. Willow had company. That's not unusual. She liked her wine nights, Ada, Celeste, Dana, and sometimes Margot when she could get a sitter. I stood there on the top step for a moment and felt something loosen in my chest. She had friends. The house was warm. I would walk in, say hello, make myself scarce, and finally let the day fall off my shoulders. I turned the handle quietly so I wouldn't startle anyone mid-sentence. I don't know why I paused. Maybe it was because the voices dropped at exactly the wrong moment, one of those strange atmospheric dips in a conversation where everyone breathes at the same time. Or maybe it was instinct. 12 years of surgery teaches you to listen for the thing that doesn't sound right. I heard my wife's voice, bright, animated, and slightly wine-loose. "I'm going to leave him." My hand was still on the door handle. The door was open perhaps 4 inches. "He has absolutely no idea. I've been quietly transferring money out of the joint account for the past 6 weeks. By the time I'm done, there won't be anything left worth fighting over." They all laughed. Not everyone. I registered that through the shock, but most of them. A light, wine-warmed, conspiratorial laughter. "Damn, Willow, you are ruthless," someone said. Celeste, I thought. It had that particular tone she reserved for things she found scandalously entertaining. "Poor man doesn't even suspect?" That was Ada, amused. "James?" My wife's voice. She said my name with the particular indulgent contempt of someone describing a dog that can be trusted not to bite. "He's barely home. He's been at that hospital every day this week. I swear he's married to that place, not to me. Trust me, he's the last person who would ever figure this out." There was more laughter, then quieter a voice I almost didn't recognize because it was so still among the amusement. Margot. Margot, who had driven 40 minutes to get here, who had found a sitter for her 2 kids so she could spend the evening with friends. "Willow, don't you think, is this really the right way to go about this? Talking about it here, like this?" There was a small pause, and I imagined my wife waving her wine glass. "Relax, Margot. It's just us. It's just not, I don't know. It feels wrong. He's a good man." Willow glanced at her, and the conversation changed. Ada changed the subject. They poured more wine and clinked their glasses. I stepped back from the door, then pulled it closed until I heard the latch catch. I stood on my own front step in the November cold, and I felt the world I had understood reconfiguring itself around me, quietly, the way a building settles. A series of small structural adjustments that, taken together, mean the foundation is no longer what you thought. I took out my phone and called Willow's number. "Hey, babe," she answered on the second ring. Her voice was the same voice she always used with me, the careful voice, the performed voice. "You on your way?" "Still at the hospital," I said. My own voice surprised me. It came out even, undramatic. The voice I use when I'm telling a patient's family, something I need them to absorb slowly. "It's going to be a late one. Don't wait up." "Okay, no problem. I have the girls over anyway. Stay safe." "I will." I hung up and walked back to my car. I sat in it for a long time in the dark, then drove back to the hospital. Let me tell you about Willow, because you can't understand what happened next without understanding who she was, or rather, who I had believed she was, who she turned out to be, and the painful distance between those two things. I met Willow at a fundraising gala in Chicago 11 years ago. She was a graphic designer then, talented, self-made, the kind of woman who walked into a room and rearranged it without seeming to try. She had this laugh that made everyone in a 10-foot radius want to be in on the joke. I fell hard, the way serious men fall, completely and without any of the normal defenses, because they've spent so long being careful about everything else. We were married within 18 months. The prenuptial agreement had been suggested by my attorney, Elaine M. Orr, and Willow had agreed without making it a conflict. That had impressed me. She had signed it without drama, without resentment, on a Thursday afternoon with our lawyers present and a coffee going cold on the conference table. I remember thinking, this is a woman with integrity. There was a clause in that prenup, standard language for high-asset marriages. Infidelity, financial misconduct, either party found guilty of such conduct would walk away with substantially less than they might otherwise receive. It had felt like a formality when we signed it, a legal precaution against a future we couldn't imagine. In hindsight, I wonder what she was already imagining. The marriage had started well, but careers have a way of doing what careers do, expanding to fill whatever space is permitted. Mine expanded considerably. Willow's design work tapered off after we moved to Boston, and somewhere in those years, she became, in her own telling, bored. I heard it first as a complaint about the city, then about our social life, then about my hours. I tried. I took vacations I couldn't really afford to take from work. I hired help so the house wasn't her burden. I organized dinners, weekends away, the lake house in Vermont. That lake house I had bought with 10 years of 60-hour weeks, which I had named in my mind as the place we would go when things slowed down. Things didn't slow down, and somewhere in the drift, she had found someone else. I didn't know that yet, sitting in my car in the hospital parking garage at midnight on a Tuesday. I didn't know about Preston Costa, the architect she'd met through a friend's housewarming party, the man who had been receiving texts from my wife's phone for nearly 14 months. I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was what I had heard through a 4-inch gap in my own front door. But I knew enough. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the on-call room and thought with the same deliberate precision I use in surgery. Emotion is a patient you have to stabilize before you can operate. Panic, grief, rage, these are hemorrhages. You don't make decisions during a hemorrhage, you apply pressure and you wait. By 3 in the morning, I had applied enough pressure to think clearly. By 4, I had a list. The first call I made was to Elaine Moore at 7:45 the following morning, before any of my surgical team arrived, before Willow would have even considered that anything in our world had shifted. Elaine, I need to see you today, before noon if possible. James, everything all right? No, but it will be. I need the prenup pulled, and I need to talk about asset protection. There was a moment of silence. Elaine had been my attorney for 9 years. She understood what that combination of words meant. I'll clear 11 o'clock. Elaine's office was on the 32nd floor of a glass building downtown with a view of the harbor. I sat across from her in a chair I'd sat in before for real estate closings, investment structures, the routine architecture of a prosperous life. Today it felt different. I told her everything. She listened, and not once did she interrupt me. That was one of the things I have always valued about Elaine. She took 3 pages of notes, then she put down her pen. The recordings from the home security cameras, are they cloud-backed? Yes, automatic. Good, don't touch them. Don't access them again until we're ready to pull the relevant footage formally. You said she's been moving money out of the joint accounts? That's what she said. Been doing that for 6 weeks. We'll need to move fast. I'm going to call Austin Frey. He's the best trust attorney in the city, and he owes me a favor. Before she realizes anything has changed, we need your assets restructured. She leaned forward. James, I have to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Do you have any reason to believe there's infidelity involved? I thought of the tone in which Willow had said my name to her friends, the indulgent contempt, the certainty. I don't have proof yet, but yes. Then we'll get proof. I have a PI I trust completely. His name is Garrett Sloan. He's discreet, thorough, and very good at finding things that people don't want found. I nodded. One more thing, Elaine said. This is going to take a few days to set in motion. During that time, you need to go home. You need to behave exactly as you always have. Can you do that? I thought about walking into my house and looking at my wife's face, knowing what I now knew. Yes, I said. I can do that. I had been doing it for years, after all. I just hadn't known it. The next 48 hours were the strangest of my life. I performed surgery. I conducted rounds, attended a department meeting about the new cardiac catheterization lab. I came home in the evenings, ate dinner across from my wife, asked her about her day, listened to her talk about a design project she was allegedly consulting on for a boutique hotel in Newport. She was a good liar. I had always known she was charming. I hadn't fully appreciated that charm and deception share the same skill set. But I watched differently now. I noticed the angle of her phone screen when she texted. I noticed how she laughed at something, and then immediately looked to see if I had seen. I noticed the small theater of a marriage being performed by someone who had already written its final act. Meanwhile, the machinery was moving. Austin Frey worked with a speed that suggested he had done this before for men in exactly my situation. Within 36 hours, the trust documents were drafted. The house, a 4-bedroom federal in Newton that I had purchased 7 years earlier, with a down payment drawn entirely from my own premarital accounts, moved into the James T. Park Family Trust. The lake house in Vermont followed. Investment accounts, a commercial property I held with 2 partners, a private equity stake in a medical device company, all restructured, all protected, all operating under an architecture that had existed, as far as any paper trail was concerned, for longer than it actually had. Garrett Sloan delivered his preliminary findings on day 3. I sat in Elaine's conference room and looked at photographs I didn't particularly want to see. Preston Costa, 41 years old. divorced, and had an architectural firm on Newbury Street. He and Willow had been meeting at a service apartment in the Back Bay that he rented by the month. The records showed consistent visits, 14 months of them, on Tuesdays and Thursdays when she had told me she had a yoga class. She had never had a yoga class. I looked at the photographs for a long time, not with the agony I would have expected. That would come later in the small hours of the night when the controlled professional exterior finally cracked. In that conference room, what I felt most was something cold and clarifying. The prenuptial agreement, the clause for infidelity. The asset transfers all were already complete. The architecture of the life she had been planning to strip from me was now the architecture of her own undoing. "We're ready to file," Elaine said. "File," I said. Willow was served on a Friday morning. I wasn't there for it. I was in surgery. A triple bypass on a 63-year-old man who deserved every ounce of my attention and concentration. I had timed it deliberately. There is a particular cruelty in leaving someone to absorb devastating news alone. I'm really not a cruel man, but I hadn't been given the luxury of an audience when I stood on my own front step and heard my wife laugh with her friends about the husband who would never figure it out. She called me 11 times while I was in surgery. I saw the missed calls when I emerged 3 hours later, still in scrubs, still with the focus of the operating theater humming in my nerves. I called Elaine instead. "She's been served?" I asked. "An hour ago. James, she tried to access the joint account at 9 this morning." Of course she had. In the 3 days since that Tuesday night, she had told her friends she was draining the account. She had moved approximately $42,000 into a personal account we had opened together 2 years ago, one she believed I was unaware she had effectively made primary. What she hadn't anticipated was that Elaine had flagged that account in the asset restructuring and had already filed for a temporary financial restraining order pending the divorce proceedings. The account was frozen. The money she had moved, the $42,000 of our joint savings, was now a matter of legal record, documented, dated, and time-stamped as evidence of the financial misconduct clause in the prenuptial agreement. She called my cell again at 2 in the afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. Then I sat in my office and listened to what she left. James, I need you to call me, please. There's been some kind of mistake, or please just call me. We can talk about this. Whatever is happening, we can talk about it. Call me." Her voice was the voice of someone who had walked into a room and found all the furniture gone. That particular emotion of a space that used to contain your life. I understood that emotion. I had felt it standing on my own front step 4 days earlier. I didn't call her back that day. Her attorney was a man named Vincent. He was aggressive, well-regarded in divorce law, the kind of lawyer who sends a long letter first to see if you'll flinch. The letter arrived within a week. It argued in 22 paragraphs that the asset transfers were fraudulent, that the prenuptial agreement had been signed under duress, that the security camera footage had been obtained in violation of Willow's reasonable expectation of privacy, and that my client had been blindsided by a systematic and premeditated campaign to deprive her of her marital assets. Elaine read it in my presence and set it down on her desk, with the calmness of someone who has seen better. Prenup signed under duress. She had independent counsel at signing. Yes. The camera footage. It's a home security system both parties were aware of, installed 3 years ago. No reasonable expectation argument survives that. That's what I thought. The asset transfers. They'll argue intent to defraud. Will counter that the trust structure was a legitimate estate planning measure. The timing, while convenient, doesn't establish intent. She folded her hands on the desk. James, they have nothing. They're going to make noise for several months, and then they're going to settle. She was right that it would be noisy. The months that followed were among the hardest of my professional life because of the collateral damage. Our friends learned what was happening. Couples we had socialized with had to make choices about whom they remained close to. My parents, who had adored Willow, had to hear a version of events that broke my mother's heart, not because of what Willow had done, but because of what it meant for the son she'd watched work himself half to death for a marriage that was apparently something quite different from what she'd believed. My father said very little. He was a man of few words about emotional matters, but one evening in December, he drove 2 hours from Connecticut to meet me for dinner at a place we'd been going to since I was in medical school. He ordered the same thing he always ordered. When the food came, he said, without preamble, "You did the right thing." Then he picked up his fork. That was my father. At the hospital, I was careful. My colleagues knew broadly that I was going through a divorce. I didn't discuss it. I showed up, operated, and continued to run my department. There is a version of grief that can only be survived by doing the thing you do best, over and over, until it becomes the scaffolding that holds you upright. Margot reached out in November with a quiet text. "I want you to know I'm sorry, James. I didn't know how bad it had gotten. If I'd known, I'm just sorry." I replied that it wasn't her fault, because it wasn't. She had been the only one in that room who'd had the decency to say it felt wrong. I would not forget that. The discovery process was where it unraveled for Willow's side entirely. Garrett Sloane's records were thorough, 14 months of meetings, a paper trail that included a credit card registered in Willow's name, used at restaurants where she and Preston Casta had dined, at a boutique in the South End where she had apparently purchased gifts for him, at a jeweler in Cambridge whose purchase records, when subpoenaed, yielded a receipt for a watch she had bought, not for me, as I had assumed when I saw it on a shelf in our bedroom last spring. For him. I had noticed that watch. I had assumed it was a work gift for a client. The small humiliations accumulate. You think you know the house you live in, and then someone shows you the rooms you were never permitted to enter. Vincent Harrington requested a settlement meeting in January. Elaine and I attended. Willow was there with her attorney. It was the first time I had seen her since I had moved to the furnished apartment I was renting in Cambridge, a Spartan 2-bedroom, with a view of the Charles that I had not yet bothered to decorate. She looked different, smaller somehow. I had spent 11 years watching Willow command rooms, and now she sat across a conference table with the energy of someone who had walked through a door expecting a party and found a deposition. Harrington opened with a number, a significant number, a quarter of the trust assets, a percentage of my future income, the Newton house. Elaine let him finish, then she placed a folder on the table, slid it across and said, "Given the terms of the prenuptial agreement and the documented evidence of both infidelity and financial misconduct, I don't think your client understands what her position actually is." We didn't settle that day. We went to court in March. The judge was the Honorable Eloise Rowe, 60 years old and 20 years on the bench with 500 divorce proceedings behind her. She wasn't easily impressed by arguments she'd already heard. She wasn't impressed by Vincent Harrington's arguments. The prenup was valid. The infidelity clause was enforceable. The $42,000 in transferred funds constituted documented financial misconduct. The security camera footage was admissible. Judge Rowe took 3 days to deliver her ruling. Willow walked away with her personal belongings, her car, and a sum so modest it was essentially a legal acknowledgement that the marriage had existed. The Newton house, the Vermont Lake house, the investments, the trust, all remained. I didn't feel triumphant standing in that courthouse. I have to admit that. I felt tired and sad and very far from the man who had stood at an altar 11 years earlier and promised to love someone for the rest of his life. Victory in circumstances like these tastes like nothing. It's simply the end of something that should never have been what it was. She came to the hospital in May. I was told by the reception desk that there was a woman asking for me. I knew before they finished the sentence who it would be. I asked them to tell her I was between patients and would be down in 20 minutes. Then I sat in my office and looked at the harbor through the window and thought about whether I wanted to have the conversation waiting for me downstairs. I went down. She was sitting in the atrium near the coffee cart. She stood when she saw me. She was wearing a gray coat I didn't recognize, something new purchased with whatever resources she had managed to retain from a life she had spent 11 years building alongside a man she had decided wasn't worth the truth. James, Willow. She had lost weight. There were shadows under her eyes that weren't there before. I noticed these things clinically, the way I noticed presenting symptoms, and I tried not to let them soften me. They did, a little. The heart doesn't take instructions from the law. Can we go somewhere to talk? We can talk here. She glanced at the atrium, the nurses moving through, the visitors, the ambient noise of a hospital at mid-morning. Please, James, 5 minutes, somewhere private. I suggested a small conference room off the main corridor that we use for family meetings and closed the door. We stood. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said. Her voice was steady, but barely. I know what I did. I'm not here to ask you to pretend otherwise. Then why are you here? Because I need you to know that I understood, after everything, that I didn't know what I had. I told myself a story about what our marriage was and what I needed, and what you weren't giving me. I believed that story, but I was wrong. I looked at her for a long time. Willow, I stood on the front step of our house at 11:30 at night, and I heard you tell your friends you were going to take everything from me. You said I would never figure it out. She closed her eyes. I know. I drove back to the hospital. I called you and told you I was working late so you wouldn't worry. I lay in the on-call room and thought about what I was going to do. Do you understand what that was like? Yes, no, I can't fully understand it, but I've thought about it every day since. Preston Casta, I said. 14 months. She didn't answer. Was it worth it? She paused for a very long time. No, I nodded. James, is there any? No. I said it quietly but without hesitation. There isn't. I opened the conference room door. I hope you're okay, Willow. I genuinely do. I don't wish you harm, but I'm done. She stood very still in the center of that small room, and I thought of what Margot had said at that wine night, the one voice in the room that had found the whole thing wrong. He's a good man. I walked back to my department. I had 3 patients to see before lunch. The furnished apartment in Cambridge is no longer furnished with someone else's taste. I bought a couch. I found a print I liked, an abstract piece in blues and grays that a medical student I mentored had painted in her spare time. I had it framed. The lake house in Vermont I visited in August for the first time alone. I sat on the dock and watched the sun go down over the water, and I thought about the fact that I had worked 15 years to be able to sit in exactly that place. I sat there for 2 hours, then I went inside and made dinner. Margot and I have had coffee twice. Just coffee? She's not in a place for anything more. And neither, truly, am I. But she's the kind of person who tells the truth when it costs her something, and I find I have very little patience these days for people who don't. The work continues. It always does. I had a patient in September, a 47-year-old father of 4 who came in with a blockage that would have killed him within a week if he hadn't come in when he did. We cleared it. He walked out of the hospital on a Thursday afternoon, and his kids were waiting in the atrium, 2 teenagers and 2 smaller ones. One of the little girls, maybe 6 years old, ran to him full speed, and he caught her and held her with the specific ferocity of a man who has just learned how close he came to not being there. I watched that from the doorway of the cardiac unit and felt something I haven't felt in a while. I felt purpose. There is something I have learned on the other side of all of this that I want to leave you with. The desire for revenge, the cold, surgical satisfaction of having turned someone's betrayal back against them with their own tools, is real. I won't pretend it isn't. I understood what I was doing when I restructured those assets. I understood the elegance of it. She had planned to use the system against me, and instead the system had been arranged to protect me from her. But revenge isn't the thing that healed me. It gave me closure, but closure is just the shutting of a door. The question is what you do in the room you find yourself in afterward. What I found on the other side of that closed door was myself. The man I had been before. I let the marriage become the whole of my identity. The surgeon, the son, the man who sits on a dock in Vermont and watches the light change over the water and finds that enough. If there is something you can take from this story, something beyond the specific geography of this particular betrayal, it's that the people who underestimate you have already given you the advantage. They have lowered their guard, they've been careless. And carelessness, in my experience, always leaves evidence. The cameras were running when she said what she said. They are always running. Be the kind of person worth recording. If this story made you feel something, if you found yourself on that front step with me, or in Elaine's office, or looking at photographs you didn't want to see, then you already understand why this channel exists. Story Junkie is for people who need to know that the door gets shut, the record gets set straight, and the people who thought they knew you best were wrong. Subscribe, hit that notification bell. Come back, because there is always another story, and it is always one that someone needed to tell. Take care, and God bless.